Honorable colleagues, I rise today to speak the bill S-217, an act respecting the repurposing of certain seized, frozen, or sequestered assets. I want to start by first thanking Senator Omidvar for bringing this bill forward and for reaching out to me to discuss it and to seek my support. Senator Omidvar, colleagues, has already tabled this bill on 2 occasions, and I do admire her tenacity. I also hope that third time is a charm. And I can tell you off the top that I absolutely do support this bill, just as I hope there will be support for a bill I intend to bring forward with an amendment to our Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, or the so-called Magnitsky Act, providing for more transparency in the ownership of assets of officials being considered for sanction. I believe it will further strengthen our Magnitsky Act and strengthen our ability as a country to properly deal with corruption and with human rights abuses around the world. And that, in a nutshell, is what Senator Omidvar is also seeking to do with this legislation, strengthening the way we deal with the likes of Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and those who benefit from doing their bidding to not only exact some degree of justice for their victims, but also to show them that their egregious behavior will not be tolerated by Western democracies. And the need to do that couldn't be better illustrated than what we're seeing right now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I spoke in the last parliament about Sergei Magnitsky, for whom the Magnitsky Act is named, when our former colleague, Senator Than Hai No, and I called for Magnitsky sanctions against Chinese and Hong Kong officials for what was happening in Hong Kong, and also for what was happening and is still happening to the Uyghur Muslim people at the hands of the communist regime of China. I think a lot of times, many of our colleagues think these motions and these calls for sanctions are merely symbolic, or perhaps some attempt to score partisan political points. But I hope you are now starting to appreciate that they're anything but. The truth is, we need to be unafraid to start applying these kinds of measures and this kind of thinking when dealing with the world's thugs and the world's bullies. And that's why I'm supportive of this legislation. I believe it takes the natural next step, not only in providing justice for the victims and in practical terms, alleviating some of the stress for those countries and agencies who are left to pick up the pieces from the damage caused by these tyrannical regimes, but also because it's punitive and just, and in my opinion, we need more of that. We need justice. We need fairness. One of the principles behind this bill is very simple. Really, corruption shouldn't be rewarded, period. So if you're corrupt, we will find you, we will name you, and we will take all of the wonderful treasures you amassed as a result of your corruption, and we will use those ill-gotten gains to take care of the innocent people whose lives you ruined or tried to ruin because of your thirst for power. We need to send a message loud and clear that the days of corruption paying off, the days of living the high life of the misery of others while they live in fear and squalor are over and should never, ever be tolerated. And Canada wouldn't be alone in moving on legislation of this kind. With both countries agreeing to sanctioning oligarchs as a result of the invasion of Ukraine, Switzerland already allows for the repurposing of frozen assets, and the UK is considering similar legislation. And just yesterday, Alaska Congressman Don Young announced plans to introduce legislation that would allow US authorities to seize Russia mega yachts and auction them off to fund humanitarian aid and other just causes. And we should be doing the same. But in order to do so, we would need to pass this bill and pass it quickly. And we could go on, and we can go one step further, colleagues, as suggested by Senator Omidvar in the case of Ukraine. Canada could lead the way by proposing a global fund consisting of these monies purloined by Putin and his oligarchs to sustain the humanitarian and reconstructions needed that will follow. A fund that could be administered by the legitimately elected government of Ukraine. But again, any such action would require this bill to become law. So let's not waste any more precious time, colleagues. Let's get this bill into committee and let's get it passed and over to the other place without delay. Many voices are calling for it. We're all watching the tragic events unfold in Ukraine over the past week. No matter what happens in the coming days and weeks, the human toll is enormous. We're already seeing tens of thousands of people flocking to the borders as they flee their homeland. They will now be added to the more than 82 million other people displaced around the world, more than half of whom are children, in what Senator Omidvar rightfully called a displacement calamity. More than 82 million people who have fled their homes because of armed conflict, violence, persecution, and human rights abuses by bullies and thugs. As Senator Omidvar pointed out, and I quote, "This is the second highest number of the forcibly displaced since the Second World War, and the numbers continue to rise daily. This has created a significant strain, especially on those jurisdictions that border the places they came from, and they themselves are challenged to meet the needs of their own citizens, let alone thousands of arriving refugees." The truth is, we have a tendency to get very caught up in the news of the day, to be moved by the pictures and videos coming out of countries like Ukraine and before it, Afghanistan, Hong Kong, Venezuela. And then, unfortunately, we very quickly seem to move on, business as usual. It's easy to go back to our own lives and almost forget about what's happening all the way over there. But now, in Ukraine, what we're seeing is a threat to international order and stability that is so grave, we will no longer have that luxury, colleagues. I believe that what we are facing now are not simply isolated acts of aggression and human rights abuses, but rather a global rise of totalitarianism. And we need to confront that head on, without reservation, and be unequivocal. And while we are also quick to want to help and to pledge to help in early days of these types of tragedies, the truth is we eventually return to our own lives while the work of taking care of these people has only just begun. Resettlement doesn't happen overnight. Take the situation last year in Afghanistan, for instance. We all would have opened our homes in that instant as we watched the horror, people swarming to the airport trying to get out of Kabul. But the truth is, a lot of those people, and many more who did manage to get out of Afghanistan prior to Kabul falling, are now displaced. They remain displaced. I know many of our offices have been working with Afghan refugees, thanks to the tireless efforts of Senator McPhedran. And while there has been some success stories, this is a long and arduous process and an expensive one. But what Senator Omidvar is proposing is, and I said, a practical solution, a logical solution. Colleagues, while I appreciate Senator Omidvar referring to what's being proposed here as thinking out of the box, it really isn't. And I don't say that as a criticism or to be dismissive, but only because I want to point out that it's not so radical that it should consume us for any great length of time. It really is very straightforward and already has broad support. As a matter of fact, as Senator Omidvar points out, it's something that we in the Conservative Party of Canada had in our electoral program in 2021. And it was in the Liberal Party of Canada electoral program in 2018. It was also in the mandate letter to then Foreign Affairs Minister Philippe François Champagne, which has me questioning why it hasn't been acted upon already. But I don't want to be accused of being partisan, so I will just say that it's obvious that both the current government and Her Majesty's loyal opposition are in support of the intention of this legislation, and I see no reason to delay its passage and to commit this to the committee stage as soon as possible. The purpose of this legislation, too, and I quote, is to seize the frozen assets of corrupt foreign officials held in Canada through court order and repurpose them back to alleviate the suffering of the people who have been harmed most by their action. End of quote. This, colleagues, is a no-brainer. It's obvious. Now, I know on its face, it may make some people feel uncomfortable, especially with what we recently witnessed by our own government arbitrarily freezing bank accounts and the mayor of Ottawa musing about the city taking possession of protesters' property or to sell and use the proceeds to pay for policing and cleanup. And yes, that is and should be troubling. But what Senator Omidvar is proposing here is nothing like that. If anything, this bill guards against that sort of overreach because her legislation would actually remove politics from the equation, instead placing the decision making in the hands of our courts. It's similar, actually, to what we see in class action lawsuits in which assets are frozen and can ultimately be used to fund any damages awarded. What Senator Omidvar is proposing would ensure that same due process and adherence to the rule of law and compliance with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It would provide transparency of the process, but also of the assets that have been seized, which we currently do not have. Our government publishes the names of those officials who have been sanctioned, but not their assets. And as noted by Senator Delphon, another way this process is already entrenched in Canadian law is the Proceeds of Crime Act. So we aren't reinventing the wheel here. No offense, Senator Omidvar, I'm in no way attempting to diminish your proposal or the work that has gone into this bill by you and your office and the World Refugee and Migration Council. I applaud you for applying this principle to this issue. My motivation in driving home the point that the intended purpose of this bill isn't entirely radical is for the benefit of our colleagues so they can be comfortable with it. The principle of taking from a perpetrator, especially one who benefited financially from their crimes, to give to their victim or victims is one in which I believe wholeheartedly. If no other reason, I believe it's called justice. And furthermore, it alleviates the toll on the system as a whole. It really is straightforward, colleagues. The criminals get punished, the victims receive some justice and much needed support, and the system doesn't break under the weight of it all. And it's all done through the rule of law and due process. And with that, I reiterate my support, wholehearted support for this bill, and implore our colleagues to do the same and get this bill to committee forthwith and approved as soon as possible. Thank you, colleagues, for your attention.